Welcome to the Craft and Character Podcast. Steve Carter here, and in association with my good friends at Preaching Today, who want to help you get better at the craft of communication. And also my good friends at Food for the Hungry, who are doing incredible work, especially with the recent earthquake that has affected Syria and Turkey. And also our good friends at Hope International University, HIU, my alma mater. We bring you a podcast that helps you get better at the craft of preaching, and always in hopes that your character will lead the way. You know that this year we are trying to walk you through how to prepare, how to write, how to actually engage with the text and write sermons that speak to the hearts, that move people into deeper formation in Christ, and also get to actually embody the ways of Christ in the marketplace and in the church and out on the streets. Today I'm really excited because every once in a while, I'll interview someone that I've actually never met. Very rarely do I, because again, in the title, craft and character, but sometimes I hear people's names, and the names that just keep coming up again and again and again. I just take notes of it. And there's been a professor at Truett Seminary. He has written a number of books. He is the professor of preaching there. His name is Jared Alcantara. And I totally butchered that name. I'll let him say it because he just says it so well. But he is someone that just in a few moments already of us just chopping, I'm like, this is going to be an important episode. So get ready. If you've got a notebook, if you've got a pen, get ready, because I'm taking you to the classroom, and you are going to learn. You are going to learn. You're going to get to learn because he's done research, and he actually wrote 2 books on a historic Black preacher named Gardner Taylor. We're going to talk about that. He also wrote another book that is all about the practices of preaching, and he breaks down what every preacher needs, and it's unbelievable. And then I'm hoping it leads to his latest book, because it's actually going to be something that I know many of you are going to go out and get and apply it in an upcoming sermon series. So without further ado, Jared, thank you for joining us on the Craft and Character Podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me, Steve. And your name has come up over the last few months and years in all the best ways. Thank you for your attempt at my last name, Alcantara. You can call me Jared, just because that's easier. And so I'd be happy to just have you refer to me as Jared throughout our time together.
Man, I felt it so strong, but then as I started to say it, I got in my head, and I knew, I was like, this isn't good. Get out. I was like Goose in Top Gun. But anyways, man, I'm so grateful that you're here, that we get the chance to talk. It's one of the things that people raved about was your actual desire around centering voices from the margins and learning, especially when it came to preaching. You did a lot of work on the history of a preacher and actually wrote about that. But the ways in which probably, I wonder, is it from your own experience, but you have this appreciation from so many streams of preaching. Let's maybe start there and talk about where that originated from.
Yes, absolutely. And I've heard a couple folks say this through the years. I'm trying to remember the source, but this whole idea that often our theologies are our autobiographies in disguise, right? So I can resonate very, very much with that notion because that's so much a part of my autobiography. So my father's from Honduras, from Central America. When he immigrated to the United States, he joined the military, but encountered all kinds of issues related to racism, ethnocentrism, because he was someone from another nation coming to the United States. I grew up bicultural, so my mom's white, my dad's Latino. I grew up in subsidized housing, so there was actually 40 different nationalities represented, different languages. This is in New Jersey, where I'm from. And also, I probably in my adult years, more than in my teen years, got into situations where I heard phenomenal African-American preaching as well. And so here I am, this Latino person who grew up around Spanish, grew up going to Latin America, but then also as I went through college and seminary, being in Black church spaces and just being invigorated by the preaching that I was hearing there. It really led to the direction that I ended up taking my work, which was to center underrepresented minoritized voices. And so that's really been a big part of the work that I did when I was doing the dissertation, the work that I'm doing now. So I teach courses, the standard courses, intro to preaching or history of preaching, but then also I have a particular interest in Black preaching, Latino preaching, Asian North American preaching, and then in studies that would center those voices in particular. So that's been something that I care deeply about as a researcher. And then as a teacher, I'm always thinking in intro. So this affects every class: intro, history, all the classes that might be core classes. How might I find a way to represent the history of the tradition in a way that honors that, before Christianity was European and American, it was African and Asian. How can I do that in the history of preaching course? How can I honor that there's a great cloud of witnesses, preachers who come through the years, who are from these minoritized preaching traditions, or preachers from majority world churches in other parts of the world, who are names that people would instantly recognize, but that folks in North America might not recognize right away. Or in my case, with Latin American preachers, a Cecilio Arrastia from Cuba, or Osvaldo Motesi from Argentina, or Orlando Costas from Puerto Rico. Like, all those names matter to our understanding of preaching. And sometimes those books are in Spanish, so there have to be ways in which we get those names more in front of people. But even for books that are in English that are written by scholars from the global South, it's that much more important for us as part of the global church to make sure that we're honoring that Christianity is world Christianity and that theology is global theology.
Man, it's so beautiful. And I love how you describe that. I'm curious, as you start to talk about this, and I just imagine you kind of in a context and then really stepping in to learn from, some of these historic Black voices and African-American voices, or going to learn from a voice in Cuba or one of our Asian brothers and sisters as they preach. Do you find when you think about the different spaces, denominations, or races when they teach, that you're like, man, this is man, what the Black preacher brings to the conversation of preaching, and what the Asian voice brings, and what the Latino voice, like they're, because yes, they're preaching Christ, but like there's a homiletical beat that you find in Black preaching that you don't find often in white preaching. Like, have you been able to, in your breakdown, begin to recognize in the minoritized voice, like, man, this is gold, and man, other streams need to hear this. Have you been able to like center in on some of that? Or is it just more kind of learning from these legends in these different contexts that, it's names that you rattled off from Cuba and Puerto Rico that many majority cultures never heard of and needs to? Like, is it more just highlighting those legends?
Well, I think it's a combination. So yes, I think for the next generation of preachers, for the next generation of students who are in seminary training to be preachers, to know that there's not a West and the rest way of understanding the history of preaching or understanding preaching today. So knowing that, I think, can be especially formative for anyone to decenter in all the best ways. But then on the practices side, I'm a better preacher if I apprentice myself to preachers who don't look like me. Now, I can apprentice myself to preachers who look like me too, or who come from the same context. But there's just something about that willingness to hear, to be open, to learn different ways of engaging text, different ways of preaching sermons, different contexts in which sermons are preached, that can be inherently formative and make us better preachers. So I think about like music. If you're trained in classical music, it doesn't mean that you can't benefit from jazz. It doesn't mean that you can't benefit from reggae or hip hop. You can actually become a better musician by learning about the rules of engagement in other genres of music. I think the same can be said. It doesn't mean that you'll suddenly become a reggae hip hop artist if you were trained in classical. And it doesn't mean that if you're used to playing jazz that you should play classical. No, it means that everyone who's engaged in this larger thing called music becomes a better musician because they know more about other genres of music.
Yes.
And their practices improve because they're learning rules of engagement and learning what good music sounds like in other spaces.
Yeah, that's amazing. And you did this because you wrote 2 books centered around the legend Gardner Taylor. And I mean, I think it's really, really beautiful the way that you talk about that, because there are times where younger communicators will see someone and go, I just want to sound like them. And they will kind of appropriate that sound. And it might be from a different culture, a different age, or a different, and I see this, man, I just want to sound like Judah Smith, or I just want to sound like, Albert Tate, or I just want to sound, and what I love the way that you said that was learning the rules of engagement and beginning to identify that, and that can make your own sound, your unique sound that God's given to you, so much stronger. Talk about Gardner Taylor. Why him? And what was some of those rules of engagement that you found in that you actually put pen to paper in 2 books, but one learning from a legend?
Well, before I get to Gardner Taylor, I'll just say I was smiling and nodding when you were talking about how preachers sound like the preachers they admire. So I see this, I hear this all the time. I'll know that person's listening to this preacher or that preacher. And I try to normalize that to some extent because we need to sound like the people we admire as we develop our voice. So we sound like someone else before we sound like ourselves, especially if it takes a while to develop your own voice as a preacher. If we stay stuck in trying to be a carbon copy of someone else, then I think that exposes us as inauthentic eventually. We have to learn somehow. So we apprentice ourselves to people we admire. So when it comes to Gardner Taylor, I would make a really bad Gardner Taylor. There's things that I appreciate about him that I have incorporated into my own preaching. And there might be ways from time to time that something I do might remind someone of something that he did.
Yeah.
But it would be a mistake for me to imitate him. I can emulate his best practices. So a word about him, though. Part of what drew me to him was I heard about him growing up in New Jersey. He pastored a church in New York for 42 years. And so that was a name that I heard growing up. And then when I was in college and then eventually in seminary, and I started being engaged in different things that were put on by Black churches, like midweek revivals, the name came up some more. And then it came time, even in seminary, to talk about different preaching traditions. The name came up again. And then I started having people say, like, you should really study Gardner Taylor. So then when I went on to do my PhD, I discovered that the person who I would be working with was considered one of the preeminent Black homileticians in the country and knew Gardner Taylor personally. So I was like, oh my goodness, God must be putting these things together. And part of what I loved about him was not only could I learn about him intellectually, but God was ministering to my spirit and to my soul as I heard him preach. He was still living, even though he was retired. He was unwell physically. So I could get to know him even in those latter years of his life. And I could become a better preacher. And so when all those things combine together, that's the sort of thing that makes you want to wake up in the morning and write 250 pages, and try to submit that to a committee someday. So that helped me get through. That got me over, Steve. That got me over. But Gardner Taylor was born in 1918, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, grew up during Jim Crow era segregation in the South, had some major events transpire in his life that led him, instead of wanting to become a lawyer and study at the University of Michigan, he became a preacher. Some like to say he became God's lawyer, arguing God's case before the people. But long story short, he ended up in Brooklyn, New York, at this amazing, historic, influential Black church at the age of, 32, something like that. He was pretty young when he started there, or the age of 30, 1948, and pastored there for 42 years. And this is someone who knew Malcolm X, was a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr., had an ongoing commitment to preaching, but also a commitment to ministries of compassion and justice. And so his activism was all coming out of proclamation, right? That the good news of the kingdom spills out into how we think about education and housing, and how we think about voting rights, and how we think about injustices in our city and in our country and in the world. But he was looked up to by more than one generation of African-American preachers. His nickname was the Dean of the Nation's Black Preachers. That was Time Magazine. Some called him the Poet Laureate of the American Pulpit. But I learned so much just from reading his sermons, from listening to them, from getting to know him a little bit better. The first book is called Crossover Preaching. That was the dissertation. So that's really theoretical. There's a lot of 30,000 feet kind of stuff. But the basic claim of that is that here you have this person who showed an intercultural proficiency long before we were talking about cross-cultural communication, and who showed an improvisational proficiency long before we were talking about negotiating difference across race and ethnicity and church and nationality. And that preachers now more than ever need to develop those proficiencies in an intercultural church with an intercultural future. So that's like super technical stuff. But I loved getting into that work and getting into this part of him that I think hadn't really been talked about, which is that he was this crossover preacher. He could engage, he could cross over into these boundaries of racial, ethnic, ecclesial difference in the way that Jesus did.
Yeah.
So Jesus found a way to reach out to outsiders. Jesus found a way to reach out to the poor and the marginalized. Jesus found a way to communicate one way to religious people and communicate another way to the people of the land. And so here's someone who's doing that, who in a way forms a case study for why we should keep doing that in obedience to Jesus, the one who crosses over for us and for our sake. So that was where I went with the dissertation. And then the second book is called Learning from a Legend, where Gardner Taylor can teach us about preaching. And that's where I get real practical. So I talk about 6 lessons that we can learn. So it's what Gardner Taylor can teach us. And so the lessons are pain, redemption, eloquence, apprenticeship, context, and holiness.
Wow.
So pain, he experienced a lot of pain in his life growing up in Louisiana, a lot of personal tragedy that impacted him. Yet there's this understanding, I think, that we so often forget, that as God breaks us, somehow God lets us know that God can still use us. And so that's what happened in his life with all that he went through. Redemption is about the fact that a sermon should always have good news. Tom Long likes to say, no news is bad news in a Christian sermon. So we're explaining, but we're also proclaiming.
Yes.
Eloquence is that sometimes we think that the only way to think about language is as a plain style way of thinking about it. But he was this person who believed that words have a currency, that if you debase that currency, if you don't think about using words well and wisely and to use them in such a way at such a time as to communicate the beauty and power and wonder of the gospel, not so that people will be impressed with you, but so that people will be impressed with the gospel, that matters, that's important. Apprenticeship. Here's someone who apprenticed himself to the nation's best Black preachers, but also apprenticed himself to other preachers from other traditions, and who believed that actually listening to, better understanding, emulating preachers from all different kinds of backgrounds was just part of what it means to get better. And if we start to settle and think that we've arrived, then that's a problem. That can even be a character problem if we're not careful. Context, he talks about how Ezekiel, yes, was brought up to the throne room of God and yes, heard the angel's wings. But right after that vision, right after the heavenly vision, he sits down at the Kebar River and he weeps with the people.
Wow.
So what does it mean to be a preacher who, yes, hears the angel's wings, but also, this is the old King James, who sits where they sat. So this is what we're called to do. Ian Pitt Watson likes to say that so often our failure as preachers is our failure as pastors in disguise. So Taylor says, no, we are called to be with the people, be for the people. If you're aloof, if you're unavailable to people, if people can never touch you or talk to you, then something's wrong. You're called to contextualize to your community in a way that's accessible to that community. And then holiness, here is this preacher who understands that whenever we engage on the scholarly side, we're called to be reverent. Whenever we're engaged in the study of the scriptures, if we're not careful, that won't be prayerful study. To pray is to work, and to work is to pray. Here's someone who believed that our character does matter. Yes, God can superintend over our weaknesses and flaws. We shouldn't do the sorts of things that would disqualify us from being a person who has spiritual authority over others. At the same time, God is the sort of God who wants us to draw in, to draw close, who doesn't want us to, as they say in some Black church circles, preach the birds out of the trees, but our lives are like hell, right? If you can preach the birds out of the trees, but you're sin sick in your soul and you're doing the sorts of things that are displeasing to God, Taylor says we can't have that as preachers of the gospel. So that's just a not so quick summary of the lessons that I lay out that we can learn from him.
No, when you talk about his eloquence, even the way he would tell a joke, like his ability to like lull you in and then turn it on a dime. I mean, like, and then the phrasing, the one sermon he did, it was like called Driven by Desperation, and just the way that he would say the syllables, and you would just were like, man, I want that. I want that, and it just, like you said, the eloquence, not to be like, oh, he's amazing, but the eloquence that made you desire that good news and that gospel as a way of life. I mean, just intentionality, I think, is amazing about his voice. I'm curious too, because as you think through the classes that you teach at Truett, and you can highlight these different, and you guys even do like an amazing preaching conference at Truett every year, where it brings in different kind of voices and backgrounds. For you, who are some of your favorite like Asian voices that have like spoken, that you're like, man, I would love to do learning from a legend book on some of these voices?
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. One colleague who recently joined us at Truett, formerly at another school at Gordon Conwell, Matthew Kim, has co-written a book with Daniel Wong. I have great regard and appreciation for them. It's called Finding Our Voice, and it's about Asian North American preaching. There are, others who have phenomenal ministries. You've got Francis Chan, you've got Sung Chan Ra. Sometimes when we think Asian American ministry too, we don't think about Indian Americans who are brilliant communicators. And so one sermon that I assign is by Kamalesh Stephen, who's an Indian Christian pastor in the Philadelphia area. So sometimes we don't necessarily think about immigrant congregations in the United States. We might be thinking about sermons in another language in another country, when so often those sermons are in the major cities of the United States and in the towns too. I went to school with one person from Nepal who Christianity had only been legal in his country for 50 years. And so this person was basically like a church father, right? This person was part of the forming of a Christian tradition that had been illegal for so long and that suddenly had become legal. In his case, what does it mean to preach the gospel in a predominantly Hindu context in Nepal? Or what does it mean to preach the gospel to Nepali immigrants here in the United States who are coming from that context? So those are just a few names that come up. A Kathy Kong is an example of an incredible woman preacher who's coming out of an Asian North American context. Yunju Mary Kim has written a lot more on the mainline side to talk about Asian American preaching, and so I could go on and on. I won't, but there's just phenomenal contributions that are so important for us to hear and learn and understand.
Well, I just, again, I appreciate that so much. I think that is a weakness in my preaching game, to be honest. And I think, probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, during Black History Month, I started to, usually started on Martin Luther King Day, Dr. Martin Luther King Day in January. I would read one of his sermons and kind of just reflect on that. But then I would kind of carry over to really spending that month of February just to kind of listen. But then it kind of hit me and dawned on me like, from the Latino side, like who are the Latino voices that are helping shape a bigger sense of the gospel, and who are my Asian brothers and sisters who are helping me shape. I maybe do this for 1 month, and it's important. It's an important practice, but there are also some other voices. And so when I heard that, like, you have spent so much of your life and work really trying to bring some attention and really shaping the future voices of our church to help them learn, and that was both so inspiring and also like humbling, because I just realized, man, so even as you say those names, I'm like, I'm going to go find those books and go listen to those, because I so agree with you. When I've sat under people who have a different homiletical beat or a different approach, and I learn, like, I love how you said there, those rules of engagement, gosh, it only can make me stronger. And also to even be stretched from a different way at which, like, some truth, I'm like, I always heard it this way. But then when I hear it from my Chilean brothers and sisters and their context coming out of, experience with Pinochet and civil, like, unrest, to hear that, it changes the context or the meaning or the depth or perspective from that text. And so just from one, fan, thank you. And that ministers to me right now. And it's a good reminder and a good challenge. And I hope every one of you who are listening, like, even just take this month, Black History Month, and are there some voices? You can go online right now. You can listen to Gardner Taylor on YouTube. You can listen to Evie Hill. You can listen to many different voices who are just fantastic. But even the names that you heard, maybe might be reading a book. And but I also wanted to get to, because you wrote this book on the practices of preaching, and you walk through really 4 distinctives that I think for anyone listening, whether you're an emerging voice, whether you're someone who's in seminary, whether someone who's been, and I know I got people, because you email me, that have been, in the pulpit for 40 some years, and you're still wanting to get better, and you're still listening to this podcast, hoping to get better. I'm telling you, when you learn these 4 distinctives, you're going to want to go buy this book, but you're going to be like, one of these I need to work on. Even when he told me the 4, I was like, yep, I know the one right now that I need to work on. So Jared, talk about that for those 4 distinctives.
Yes, thanks, Steve. The reason I wanted to write the book was that I had been a pastor serving in churches in different places, first in Illinois, then Massachusetts, then Oregon, where my wife's side of the family's from, then New Jersey, serving a church while I was trying to do my dissertation. But just as conversations drifted toward preaching, I could hear over and over again, like a similar refrain, excuse me. And often I would hear people say, so often I'm given a method that I need to master, but there's this huge gap between the method that's proposed and the tradition from which I come. Or they would say, what we're reading is very much centering Anglo voices, and we're in a diverse classroom. Or they would say it's only one voice, and I'm more used to learning from a multiplicity of voices. Or they would say I'm an audio learner or a visual learner, and I'm used to learning through hearing and through seeing. So I need some more concrete examples. And then there's generational shifts too. So folks saying technological innovation is needed. So it really led me to think about, well, how would I write, a practice-centered book rather than a method-centered one? One that's intentionally collaborative rather than one that's just one voice. One that is strategically diverse so that various ethnicities, races, nationalities, traditions are represented. And then technologically innovative so that people could engage with, an enhanced e-reader edition, and there'd be hyperlinks in it. They could hear audio, they could see video. So then I recruited a team of collaborators, different backgrounds, contexts, races, ethnicities, genders, to have conversations about the book, and just something, just like you were talking about how when you sit under someone else who follows a different homiletical beat, it's inherently formative for you. That's what I wanted. I wanted that conversation to form us as we sat around the table, but then I also wanted to form students as they engage with the resource and as they engaged with the video content associated with the resource. Now, part of what guided me to the practice-centered approach, and this is to your point about the 4 commitments, was this whole understanding of deliberate practice. So I was getting into that stuff and it was blowing my mind. It was really causing me to rethink things. There's this guy named K. Anders Ericsson. So he popularized his research in a book called Peak. And he noticed as he was studying expertise in any area, right? Whether that's sports or languages or dance or classical violin, he noticed that people who had really grown into their gifts, their calling to pursue a certain thing, dance, music, fill in the blank, ascribed to 4 commitments. And the 4 commitments were as follows: focused attention, concrete goals, constructive feedback, and the willingness to take risks. So take a Michael Phelps: concrete goals, focused attention, constructive feedback, the willingness to take risks. Or Ray Allen, who at least until recently had the all-time championship of three-pointers. Focused attention, concrete goals, willingness to take risks, constructive feedback. But all of that's framed around coaching. So I have a friend who likes to say that so often now today, people will only listen to truth from 2 kinds of people: from coaches and from doctors. And sometimes they don't even want to listen to either, right? But if a coach tells you need to work on your free throws, you need to work on your free throws. Or if a doctor tells you need to take medication that will lower your cholesterol, hopefully you lower your cholesterol. So to have a coach in your life, it doesn't mean that that person is a big name preacher that everybody's heard of. You know, people can't necessarily name Tiger Woods' coach or name Michael Jordan's coach or name any tennis star's coach. They can't necessarily do that, and that's fine. But someone who's trained to help you realize the goals that you've set, to give you constructive feedback, to help you engage in focused attention, to help you take risks, and to be able to speak into your life. So just as every Timothy needs a Paul, so also every Paul needs a Timothy, someone to mentor, someone to invest in, someone to help toward this growth over time. So again, we're not trying to master great preaching so that people will be able to say, "Oh, what a great preacher she is! What a great preacher he is!" That's not the point. No, instead the point is we cultivate life-giving practices over time, so that people will hear our preaching and say, "What a great God you have! What a great gospel you have!" And they'll sense that it not just matters to us that our sermons sound good, that it matters to us that we have a word from God to share with people. Now, I can get into some of the practices that I commend, but I don't want to jump ahead of you if you want to. I've been talking for a while. So what would you like to ask?
No, well, I think it's really, really important because, and we've talked about this on this podcast before, that sometimes, and I really want to get your take on this because, obviously being at Truett, and you guys have a plethora of some incredible thought leaders and teachers at Truett right now. It's just amazing. You dropped Matthew Kim's name. I think very highly of him and various others. But I think sometimes when it comes to preaching, I have found that the older you get, there's a level of vulnerability with preaching that maybe in your 20s you were open to coaching, but as you start to get into your 30s, it feels like the desire for coaching, and maybe because you might have the coach as an executive coach to help you with the managing and the business and the building plans, but the coaching from a preacher ends up to kind of diminish. And I was talking to Nancy Beach about this, and Nancy Beach said, there is a humility required within every preacher. And I just love the required humility to ask a Paul for help, to ask And I think those 4 commitments are really, really important. And you look at every professional, athlete, they have that. You look at LeBron James, he spends over 7 figures just on what he puts in his body. He's a coach for what he puts in his body. And I think that there's some sense of resistance that often happens when it comes to a preaching coach compared to an executive coach. And I'm just like, in your kind of teaching and even talking about this, the practices of a preacher, have you found some sense of resistance in preaching, and how have you helped people circumvent that?
Yes. Well, there's even resistance for preachers starting out. I think because it's so personal, and because we can also struggle whenever we're getting into like the technical aspects. If someone has prayerfully prepared a message and it's on their heart, if it gets into some of our own struggles with the flesh too. Like if we're perfectionists and someone says this wasn't perfect, then we don't want to hear that. It'd be like, telling a new mom that her baby is ugly. Like, nobody wants to hear, my baby's beautiful. Don't say a word about my baby. That's how people feel about their sermons.
Right.
And so they could feel it when they're 22, or they could feel it when they're 42, or they could feel it when they're 62. I have observed a similar pattern, which is you're young, you're starting out, you've got very few reps, but you're recruiting people into your life and they can speak into it. But as we get older and as we get busier, as we get into a certain routine or rhythm, there's a certain risk involved, like you said, that risk of being humble and saying, okay, I've been doing this for 2 decades or 3 decades, but I haven't arrived. Would you speak into this? Would you help me? I think it touches on our insecurity. It can touch on our pride or arrogance. If we feel like we're really good at something, then we can struggle to have other people tell us we're not as good as we think we are at it.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of those pieces. It made me think of Erickson too, and I don't want to geek out too much on the research, but one of the things he likes to say or points out is that just because you've been driving for 20 years doesn't mean you're a better driver than someone who's been driving for 5. Or just because you've been a doctor for 20 years doesn't mean that you are as good a doctor as one who's been doing it for 5. Because if you try harder, then you might not be practicing in the right way for the right reasons. He says you should try differently. Ascribe to these 4 commitments, recruit a coach into your life. That's what separates the violinists who really excel from those who don't, the ballet dancers, the chess masters, the elite athletes. That all matters. Now, I think that's a word of hope. It can feel like a rebuke. And in ways it can, because it means that if you've been preaching for 20 years, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're better than you used to be.
Right.
He calls it a level of automaticity sets in that can lead to diminished outcomes. So you can actually get worse than you used to be as a driver or a doctor if you settle, if you plateau. So just because you've been a preacher for 20 years doesn't mean that you can't preach, but just because you've been a preacher for 2 years doesn't mean that you can't.
See, that's important. We were talking about this, Gladwell has that, because for many of us, if we think, oh, well, I've been doing this for 10,000, I just, and the way you said it, if I just try hard enough, but then you said, yeah, but what if you've plateaued and you're just doing it from a plateaued place? You're actually gonna have diminishing returns. Talk about that, because I think for many of us are like, I just gotta get my reps in. I just get my hours in. I just gotta get this. And there's a way that we could actually try differently that actually could, get a coach that could really help us actually achieve results and growth quicker.
Yes. If you practice free throws the wrong way for 10,000 hours,
yes,
then you're better than you used to be, but you're not as good as you could be.
Right.
So you need a coach to say, practice this way instead of that way. You need to set concrete goals. You need to engage in focused attention, which is really about paying attention to our bodies, our minds. In the case of preaching, our bodies, our minds, and our spirit, and the Holy Spirit as we engage in a spiritual practice. Focused attention, concrete goals, willingness to take risks, constructive feedback. All of those loops are necessary in order for us to try differently. So Gladwell actually tried to take the 10,000 hours from Erickson, and Erickson pushed back. Because Gladwell's so popular, they don't know much about the pushback. His pushback was, yeah, if you do if you do something for 10,000 hours, you'll get better at it, but you won't master it the way that you could if you tried differently. If you had a coach, if you had these 4 commitments, it would make you better than you would be otherwise.
Here's the interesting piece, because I feel like, and I don't know. I mean, you've been doing some incredible institutions and schooling and opportunities. Been at some amazing churches along the way. I think that very, very few people and elder boards, and there's a couple of professors in particular that I had that did do this right, in my opinion. But so many were focused on my craft. And it was in some ways like, you just gotta get better, you gotta get better, you get better. And I had a couple mentors, and I had a couple professors, and I had a couple therapists, spiritual directors, who really said, almost in a try differently way around formation and character, that once I started to go after that, it was amazing how my preaching got better. Like, it was like an unlock, like, but I didn't have, it wasn't like a class on character formation. It wasn't just but realizing, even for myself, gosh, some of the subconscious push, just, okay, master this method, get better at this method, make sure your transitions are tight, but not actually asking the questions of what was going on in me. And I love how you said that, not just mind and body, but also spirit, and our attentiveness and openness to the Holy Spirit. And that's another stream that, as you begin to like open yourself up to that, you do that well, your preaching is going to get better, And I know that for you, even just your most recent book, you wrote all on the Proverbs, and it's called How to Preach the Proverbs. But I'm curious, like, why that book out of all these ones that you've done? You did the history of preaching. You've looked at legends like, Gardner Taylor. You've done, and then you're like, I'm just going to jump to Proverbs. Like, give me the backstory on why that.
Yes, well, something that shows up in the book of Proverbs, that also shows up in the practices of Christian preaching, that I'm also so glad that you brought up, is the necessity of character formation. So sometimes we might talk about, the science of preaching, or the art of preaching, or the techniques of preaching, but what we'll forget is that our goals aren't just performative goals. Our goals are spiritual goals. The feedback that we receive is also on who we show ourselves to be. Are we some kind of preaching persona, or are we actually ourselves? So a coach is someone who can speak into our lives spiritually. The sermon is an opportunity for us, yes, to engage, knowing that it's an engagement in communication, and that we're educationally forming people, and that we're exegeting texts, and so on and so forth. That's all important. But it's also a spiritual offering unto God. So a coach can actually say, this is what Brennan Manning said to Larry Crabb. That's how old school I am, way back when. But Larry Crabb's coach was Brennan Manning, who said, every time I really sense the wind of the Spirit blowing, you told a joke. And so that's going to pierce, that's going to hurt. But there's trust there. There's community there. There's a willingness to hear and be heard. There's a willingness to know and be known. There's someone speaking into your soul, not just your techniques. So what showed up in my book on how to preach Proverbs, and that also showed up in the practices of Christian preaching, I called it the necessity of conviction, which is about our character formation in that book. And then in Proverbs, I talked about the book on Proverbs called How to Preach Proverbs. I talked about the necessity of integrity, because that's a major theme that runs through the whole book. The reason I wrote it is that I had done very little of it. I had done very little preaching from Proverbs. I'd been preaching for 25 years, and I was looking in all my files, and there were very few sermons on the book of Proverbs. And it's like, when I stand before the throne of God, what am I going to say? Like, it was just too weird to preach from that book because it made me feel uncomfortable, no, this is God's word, and it was meant to form a community, and particularly those who are young, to be wise rather than to be foolish, to be people of integrity and justice and peace, to do what is just and right and fair. That's at the very beginning of the prologue. So I thought, this is going to help me be the kind of person that I want to be. Preaching from it will help me know how to be wiser than I am now. It'll form my character. I'm thinking as a writer and as a preacher, how can I take risks? Yeah. I can start preaching from books that I don't want to preach from.
But why? Why? It feels like Proverbs is like the most axiom oriented book. Why for you as like seminary professor, why does that book make you feel uncomfortable? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. I guess I was more comfortable with different parts of Proverbs. So some of it comes back to how we were trained.
Right.
We might have been trained to preach gospel stories really well, to preach narrative well. We might have been trained to preach only from the Apostle Paul. So now that I'm teaching students, depending on their tradition, depending on their training, they'll say, oh, I'm just hanging out in the Gospels all the time, or I'm hanging out in Old Testament stories, or all I preach is Paul, right? And so some of it has to do with their theologies, their traditions, but also, how they were trained. They were trained to cut a text a certain way.
Yes.
So especially when you get in after Proverbs 12 and later, when you're getting in, instead of links on a chain, you're getting more pearls on a string, like this one's about friendship and this one's about poverty. And so it made me think, well, there's ways to preach thematically through Proverbs and still stay tethered to the text. There's ways to preach about characters in Proverbs. You have the wise, the foolish, you have the sluggard, you have woman wisdom, you have woman folly, you have the neighbor, the friend, marriages, families, you have the woman of noble character at the end of the book. And some orderings of the Hebrew canon introduce the book of Ruth right after the book of Proverbs. So it's curious that Ruth is called a woman of noble character right after the final chapter.
Right.
But I just discovered that I hadn't really spent much time there. I mean, I would read it, but I wouldn't preach from it because it just didn't really fit what I was used to doing. And I talked to a lot of people who've had a similar journey where they just don't really know what to do. It's kind of like the book of Revelation, right? If some of them might love it because that's what they do and they're used to doing it, but some of them might say, I don't even know where to start. So that was the journey that I was on, was where do I start? How do I do this more? And then how do I help other people do it better?
Man, I'm going up to preach in Edmonton next month on Proverbs 1:7 and talk about the fear of the Lord. So I actually had ordered your book. It hasn't arrived yet. So I'm super pumped, like just to see because I'm like, I need some help on this text. And so I'm really, really excited just to see what you do with that, which I'm pretty pumped about. So yeah.
Well, thank you. I hope it's a blessing to you. I hope it's beneficial to you. One thing that I explored at the very end was that there's a lot that shows up about justice. So sometimes we'll think Proverbs is a book about only our interior life, which it is about that, but it's also about our relationships. And it's written to people who have training, who have access to opportunity, and it's urging them to relate to those who have less power, to those who are marginalized, to those who are not only lost, but those who are lonely and left out. How are you going to relate to people? Because that's just something about your character too. That's just something about your integrity. One way that you know that you have the fear of the Lord is, yes, you practice discretion. Yes, you're a person of a righteous disposition, but also you do what's just and right and fair.
Man, that's a great line. That's a really great line. You do what is just, right, and fair. Jared, I have to tell you, like this interview, like an hour just flew by. And I'm like, I have like 1,000 more questions for you. And I feel like you should be like our resident theologian, that we just like come to you quite regularly, that we just because what I appreciate about you is your ability to pull from different streams. And And also just the awareness to say, yeah, some of us are living out in the Gospels or living, I just preach Paul, but even just, to be aware of that. I hope for many of you who are listening right now that you're thinking, oh, what have I been kind of shaped to kind of hang out in, and what risk, you think about those 4 commitments might I need to take to maybe go do a series on the Psalms or on the Proverbs, or maybe like for me in the last couple of years, it's realizing I don't think lament and grief and Holy Saturday was in my wheelhouse. I was moving rooms and joy meter high in larger spaces in churches, and we didn't have much room for lament. And I had to learn that. So for me, I just love what you are describing around the art form of communication, but really what it's doing within us to be the kind of people who are so open to what the Spirit wants to do in us and with us and through us and for us. Where can people find you? Because I'm sure after people listening, they're going to be like, I need to hear more from this guy. Is there any spot that people can find your work?
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, of course, Baylor and Truett and connecting in those ways, but I'm also on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And then, through my writing, there's also my books, but I'll write things for Christianity Today, Preaching Today, for other online publications. I think that's another way to find me as well. And then there's the old school way. There's always email. You can find my emails on the website. And I would be happy to get to know you better and happy to serve your listeners in whatever way that I can. That'd be my honor. That's a big way that I understand my calling, is that if I can help a generation of preachers, pastors, love God better and communicate God's word and the gospel of God better to a community so that the community is formed to be more like Christ, then I'm all in. So any way that I can help people do that, I want to. I mean, maybe for some people, the risk is to turn the sermon back into a spiritual practice because you've gotten good at it.
That's right.
So that can be a really dangerous thing. If you're really good at it, then it becomes something that might be an empty practice. So one of the risks would be to start leaning back into God forming us, the Holy Spirit preaching to us before we preach to other people. So it's going to be different for each person. It's for us to check our hearts, to just ask God, show me what it means for me to grow. Because if we settle, then if we stop learning, then we stop growing, and something in us needs to die in order for us to grow.
Man, have you ever seen the movie The Comedian?
No,
Jerry Seinfeld.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Okay, so this is exactly what you're talking about. So Seinfeld, you're gonna watch it. I guarantee you're gonna play it in one of your preaching classes. He gets to a point after the show, and he goes, "I'm no longer gonna use any of my old Seinfeld jokes. It's all new material from now on." Mm-hmm. And he had to fall in love with stand-up again. I'm not using the stuff I know that works. I gotta do the work again. And you watch him go on stage and he bombs. And he's just like, I don't have it. And then he's like talking about seeing, other comedians who can go for 2 hours straight. And he's like, oh my goodness, I don't know if I can. And he's just trying to build up for a special. And can he do it again? And he's falling. And it's also then following a younger guy who's starting out, who doesn't have the best rooms. And it's just the difference in posture and entitlement. And it is a fascinating piece where there's a lot of crossover. Exactly to what you're talking about is, especially, when it comes to preaching the spiritual practice. But man, for some of us, we're just relying on some of the old. We know that joke's going to work. We know that story's going to tell. We know that verse. We know that. And we've gotten away from the risk and the dependence and the learning and shaping that and the character development for ourselves before we can give that away, So yeah, it's a fascinating. But Jared, thank you for the time. Thank you for just your wisdom, and I look forward to more conversations. And if you're ever in Chicagoland, or I'm ever in Waco, I hope we can catch a meal and coffee together. It would be an honor to just spend time with you and get to know you in person.
Well, it's been my joy and privilege to be with you, Steve. And thank you so much for sharing just your time with me and for giving me an opportunity to communicate with you and communicate with your listeners of this podcast. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks everyone for tuning in to the Craft and Character podcast. Hey, share this episode, leave a review, let us know what stood out to you on social media. And we're excited because next month we've got some incredible guests. I can't wait to introduce you to them as well. But much love, everyone. Take a risk this week. And remember that preaching is a spiritual practice. Much love, grace and peace.